Hello everyone, and welcome to the Rotary Climate Action Team presentation and panel discussion on the recently completed UN Conference on Climate Change, COP26, that was held in Glasgow, Scotland. My name is Gary H. White, and I will present as well as moderate our panel discussion later on. First, though, I want us to take a look at some Zoom protocols that we're going to be following as we do every event. Everyone will be muted. We are recording this presentation. We're going to field questions at the end. We'll try to save some time, put them in the chat. You know how to do that. Feedback. John, are they going to be getting an email with a poll?
There's a poll at the end.
Okay, very good. So let me start out by introducing myself in the middle. I'm a proud Rotarian with the San Mateo, California chapter and an active member of the RCAT network. I'm in retirement after working for 30 years on the Silicon Valley. And I'm currently the presentations chair of the Climate Reality Project Bay Area chapter. Trained as a volunteer climate educator by the founder and chairperson of the organization, former Vice President Al Gore, in 2015. And since then, I've given nearly 300 climate talks to over 20,000 adults and youth located here in the Bay Area. So let me introduce the other panelists. Secondly, on your left, Karen Kendrick-Hands, many of you already know, is a member of the Rotary Club of Wisconsin in Madison since 2012. She helped form the Environmental Sustainability Rotary Action Group, ESRAG, to combine her passions for both mitigating climate change and providing a way for like-minded Rotarians to collaborate on the issue. She served as the ESRAG's chair, its director of communications, and is currently its director of projects. Karen was the first ever observer delegate sent by Rotary International to a UN climate conference and attended COP24 in Poland back in 2018, as well as the most recent COP26 in Glasgow. In 2020, on behalf of ESRAG, Karen presented to the Rotary Foundation's Environmental Issues Task Force. As a result, the directors of Rotary International and the trustees of the foundation unanimously accepted her report and went on to create a seventh avenue of focus, as everyone knows, for the organization, that of supporting the environment. Now, additionally, Karen is active with the Wisconsin chapter of Citizens Climate Lobby, an international climate organization, and is co-leader of its Rotary Action Team. During her years practicing law, Karen worked as a volunteer public interest advocate for cleaner air and mobility choices, including serving on various local, state, and regional advisory boards for over 30 years. Next is Rick Wayman, on your right. Rick is currently the CEO of the Foundation for Climate Restoration. Before joining the organization in September of this year, Rick co-founded and led Geocomb Homes, a sustainable modular housing company based here in California. From 2007 to 20, Rick worked at the Nuclear Age Peace Foundation, where he served as Director of Programs and Operations. He was Deputy Director and CEO as well. While at the foundation, Rick collaborated with the United Nations and participated in the negotiations that led to the 2017 Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. As an advocate for the international campaign to abolish nuclear weapons, he provided written and spoken testimony to government negotiators and served on the team that later received the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize for their accomplishments. Also in 2017, Rick met with the Pope, Pope Francis, during the Vatican conference entitled Perspectives for a World Free from Nuclear Weapons and for Integral Disarmament. He then led a coalition of over 100 civil society organizations around the world in support of the Republic of the Marshall Islands nuclear disarmament proposal at the International Court of Justice. He attended COP26. He has a BA in international business and a master's in nonprofit management and political advocacy. He's an avid long-distance ocean swimmer and lives in Santa Barbara, California with his wife, Ada, and their daughter, Lulu. So I want to welcome both of you guys to the program. What I also wanted to do before we get started, we often in the climate movement do what's called the land acknowledgement. And I'd like to take a moment and recognize and pay tribute to the indigenous Ohlone people who inhabited and stewarded our beautiful Bay Area region for thousands of years. So now we're going to go into our brief presentations, and I will start out. And I want to talk a little bit about the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel of Climate Change, and COP, the Conference of Parties. So how did the IPCC get together? Well, at the UN, the World Meteorological Organization, and the Environmental Program came together to create the IPCC back in 1988 to study and report on what was then called the greenhouse gas emissions issue. They pulled together scientists from all over the world and from all disciplines. Their work, through their assessment reports, highlights the current state of knowledge on climate change. And the reports are neutral, policy relevant, but not prescriptive. They rely on independent peer-reviewed climate research from scientists from all over. And the reports are often key inputs into COP negotiations of nations that follow up COP conferences. So what is COP? Well, set up by the UNFCCC, COP stands for Conference of the Parties. It's the supreme decision-making body of the convention. Parties or countries review documents, make decisions on international climate issues. These IPCC assessment reports, as I mentioned earlier, loom large in informing negotiations. And COPs meet every year unless the parties decide otherwise. For instance, last year, because of COVID 2020. And the location of COPs rotate among the 5 recognized regions of the world. They have been held in many, many areas. So here are a few key dates in COP history. The first one was in Berlin 26 years ago. The third was a very major and milestone COP that was in Kyoto, Japan, that produced the Kyoto Protocol, which unfortunately the US never officially signed. You can see COP6 in Bonn, 13 in Bali, 20 in Lima, Peru, and then most importantly, 2015 COP21 in Paris, where the Paris Climate Agreement was signed by all countries attending. And then this year, that should be 2021, COP26 in Glasgow that we're going to be hearing about from our guests. Now, a few details of COP that you may or may not have gotten earlier. UN Conference of the Parties, it was held from October 31st to November 12th, 2 weeks at the Major Convention Center in Glasgow, rescheduled from last year. And the goals were very, very simple and direct. Secure global net zero by 2050, 1.5 degrees centigrade within reach, promote adaptation instead of only mitigation to protect communities and habitats. They're realizing now that creating adaptation programs are going to be more important as changes begin to occur more deeply. Another goal was to deliver at least the $100 billion per year to poor countries for adaptation that had been agreed upon in Paris, but had not fully taken shape, and also work together as a world community on the climate crisis. And I think probably the most important quote that I'd heard, which was from John Kerry, the climate czar of the administration: COP26 is our pivotal moment to tackle climate change. So what were some of the anticipated challenges at COP26? Well, unfortunately, and this is still the case, Build Back Better, the Reconciliation Act, that has enormous amounts of money dedicated to climate mitigation and adaptation, has not yet been passed. So Biden had not as much leverage as he ordinarily would have had that been passed. Getting every nation to submit tougher national climate goals was really important as well. Transparency of nation-stated climate achievements, just to make sure that everything is on the up and up. That's been important. Also standardizing the counting of climate achievements, such as double counting, making sure that that doesn't happen. And then delivering the agreed upon 100 billion per year financial fund. And we'll probably hear about that from our guests. And also putting the global community on a path to keep global warming to no more than plus 1.5 degrees centigrade. So now we are going to shift. Let me see if I could stop sharing for a second.
What happened to my pretty green background, Gary? I worked hard for that.
It's coming up. Okay. Here we go.
Oh, good.
Okay.
Terrific. Thank you.
So here's your pretty green background. So Karen, take it away.
Thank you. And since you mentioned Kerry's quote, I want to reflect on the fact that Katowice, we were at the glum treadmill of knowing that the U.S. was about to depart from the climate participation with UNFCCC. And so it was very different to see a big U.S. pavilion, well-programmed, great speakers around the clock in the exhibition area. And John Kerry was everywhere. And my husband, Larry Hands, who attended with me wearing a badge from Citizens Climate Lobby, was a bit bolder. I was bold with Prince Charles. Larry was bold with John Kerry. He got in his face, said, "Hi, Rotary is here to help," handed John Kerry a card. John looked down and said, "Cool." So we are officially on the world stage, and that's what was so exciting about the COP. Why are we there? In 2018, it was clear when the scientists announced that we had to get warming down to 1.5 degrees, and we were left with a basket of inadequate, unmet promises from all the nations. Collectively and going into this COP, the promises don't equal progress to keeping warming to 1.5 degrees, and nobody's kept their promises. That's called ambition, and nobody's nationally determined contributions are ambitious enough. It's confounding but inextricable. The wealthier you are, the more carbon you have emitted to get there, for the most part. Our economy is very carbon-based. So the wealthiest nations have contributed the most to the crisis. Because carbon dioxide lasts 100 years and the US is well into its industrial revolution, we bear currently the biggest historic responsibility for emissions. But in an any year snapshot now, China exceeds ours. And a lot of the climate crisis is a wealth distribution problem. The wealthy world got a chance to develop. They emitted their increment of carbon. The global process says The developing world needs some financial help to decarbonize quickly, and the wealthy world isn't doing its job to help. We've been fiddling around since 1988 at least. Now we know that we have till 2030, which is 9 years away, and the incremental steps we need to hold things to 1.5 degrees warming, we aren't doing it. So when I was in Katowice, Secretary General Guterres said, civil society, you must lead because the nations aren't moving fast enough. I think of Rotary as quintessential civil society. Now we've got an area of focus for the environment. Where's Rotary going to lead and act to help the world close the emission gap? Next. Do you want to advance my slides? Thanks. So just a little refresher, most everybody on the call knows that Rotary since 2010 has funded its global grants in 6 areas of focus, and as of this Rotary year, we are pleased to have the environment there as well. One of the important things that happened the same year that Paris came out was the United Nations switched to 17 interrelated sustainable development goals. Those are the colored keystones on the circle on the left. And there are 6 of those 17 that relate to our single area of focus for the environment. Sustainable cities, clean energy, responsible use and consumption, life on land, life underwater, and climate action. When you look at the fact that our environment and ESRAG owns 1/3 of the Sustainable Development Goal pie in terms of Rotary action, you know what a huge mandate we have. Next. In the Bangladeshi pavilion, we had our first presentation by a former ESRAG board member, Kazi, and we were graced with the presence of Her Royal Highness Princess Esmeralda of Belgium. And she said, 2 things are missing here, a sense of emergency and the need for climate justice. The delegates are fighting over a word, as we learned at the very last minute, or a comma, but those most vulnerable climate nations are fighting for their very survival. One of the biggest areas of disappointment was no funding for loss and damage added to the Glasgow Agreement. Next. So there is a lot of money changing hands on the table under discussion at the COP. And I want you to walk through this slide with me. 130 trillion, that's about almost half of the world's global wealth, is now being managed by a consortium called the Glasgow Financial Alliance for Net Zero, or the Global Financial Alliance. And they formally announced that they were going to now, whenever they made an investment decision, you look through a climate lens. What will the impact be on the climate? Rotary ought to be doing that too. I want to be clear, the 130 trillion is not money invested in climate projects. It's half of the money changing hands in the global wealth system. And those managers have agreed they're finally going to at least ask the question, is this investment good for the planet or bad? The next number I want you to think about is that $100 billion annual commitment that was made as part of the Paris Agreement that the developed countries, through a green climate fund, would every year since 2020 pony up $100 billion to help the developing world decarbonize. They didn't do it in 2020. They won't do it in 2021. They're now deferring the first year's increment to 2023. That's 4 more years of delay. One of the program officers from the Rockefeller Foundation was on my train to Edinburgh and talked about the Bloomberg, Rockefeller, and Earth Fund Consortium. They were going to work with regional development banks to put private money. So we've got the whole global finance. Now we talked about the failure of nations to contribute, and now we're looking at the private philanthropy is going to put in 10 billion. Here's another interesting number. Early in the second week, a consortium of Europe, UK, and the US said, we're going to help South Africa decarbonize faster, 8.5 billion. Great. What's the price tag to do that for India and China? Because that's the amount of money that's needed. And then smaller amounts of money were celebrated because people were so much more desperate. The Least Developed Countries Initiative, the only people there whose countries were within the carrying capacity of the planet, were ecstatic to get a much smaller fund of $10 million that they could get faster and have more local control. And for me, one of the hardest parts was watching the Gender Just Climate Awards, Women Design, Women Valued projects, and this small program gave each of them a 2,000 euro award for four winners. And they were ecstatic. Can't we do better than that for gender just projects? And the big problem is the loss and damage that's already occurring. There's no desire from the global north to help the global south. And as one of the disgusted negotiators said, we're just pushing the least developed countries into the arms of China. Next. So when Shekhar Mehta was there for his high-level ministerial roundtable, Rotary's big debut on the global climate change, he embraced working on mangroves. Multiple reasons. The Commonwealth's Blue Charter has a robust mangroves program. The world has lost 50% of its mangrove reserves. The mangroves are particularly good at sequestering carbon 5 times the terrestrial trees. That's mitigation. They offer adaptation by providing resistance to storm surges, preventing erosion and coastline buffering, slowing saltwater incursion into freshwater aquifers. They manage that interface. Where mangroves are healthy, biodiversity soars, shrimp and fish populations are restored, and that means a more stable livelihood if the locals are careful stewards. It checks all the boxes and it's within Rotary's comfort zone. Next. At the last day, as folks were walking in to wrap up, these notes were seen around the room. The youth had desperately tried to get their message into the hands of the negotiators. Don't give in to fatigue, keep the goal of 1.5 alive. Time to phase out government coal and fossil fuel subsidies and make sure there's money for loss and damage. They made a little progress. Next. To watch the final round of negotiations, we watched remotely. So these are shots of the jumbotrons in the rooms where we were watching. Next. We thought we had a deal. We thought we were going to have clear language about getting rid of fossil fuel subsidies. We did get these, the progress of the lens for global investments, a renewed commitment to the 2014 commitment to stop deforestation, which kind of went nowhere. But as some people have been saying, well, now we've got better satellite and drone monitoring, so we can call out the folks who are breaking their commitment. The nationally determined contributions each country's climate action plan will now be renewed annually instead every 5 years. The need to avoid double counting and make sure the carbon markets run well will finally be a reality with a carbon market rule book in place. And I can explain double counting during the questions. And a renewed commitment to that annual climate fund, but we're still 3 years behind. And next. So many of the folks who are most in the path and have contributed the least to the problem, it says, for us, mitigation is too little too late. Put some money into adaptation so that our nations can save themselves. The notion of fossil fuel subsidies, currently governments collectively spend $5 trillion annually propping up the fossil fuel company whose product inevitably poisons our lungs and smothers the planet. It makes no sense for governments who can't afford to help fix the problem continue to have fossil fuel companies on welfare. But we just lost that argument in the US. And alas, no real dollars for loss and mitigation. So what would I like the people on this call to do about it? Next. My call to action is talk about climate change. I bet you all do, but we don't do it enough. We can't solve a problem if it's not front and center. Watching that film will help on December 29th. Lead with your families and use your influence in your clubs and communities, and most important, the businesses that you lead and the organizations that you lead, to get an awareness about carbon and taking concrete measures to reduce your own emissions. I hope that every Rotary project will be put through a screen of how will investing in this project help whatever country is hosting it meet its nationally determined contributions. And finally, an area that's consistent with the original UNFCCC document, avenues to support action for climate empowerment. And it's a list that is in every Rotarian's, or could be in every Rotary Club's toolkit. Education, training, public awareness, public participation, public access to information, basically making the science accessible, and fostering international cooperation. That's so much of what Rotary already does. And I imagine everybody on this call is an ESRAG member. If you're not, I hope you'll fix that. It's pretty easy and cost effective. And if your club doesn't have an environmental committee or your district doesn't, go form one. If you form it, you can kind of push them to make climate the thing they work on the most. Thanks.
Great. Thank you, Karen. Very, very informative. Okay, let me now cue up Rick.
All right.
Rick, your turn. Go for it.
Fantastic. Thanks, Gary. Grateful to John and the whole RCAT team for inviting me to be a part of this event today, and all of you who are taking the time to tune in. And thank you, Karen, for that very informative presentation. I particularly appreciate your calls to action at the end. I hope that everyone will jump on that and do it. It really does make a difference. So on my opening slide here, the obligatory conference photo, it shows I was there. I was fortunate to have the opportunity to attend COP26 last month, and really happy to be here today to share some of my experiences. Next slide, please. So before I dive into a couple of COP-specific things that I wanted to talk about, I wanted to start by defining my organization's name. So what we mean by climate restoration is restoring atmospheric CO2 to pre-industrial levels by 2050. Right now, there are about 1 trillion tons of excess CO2, which is also sometimes referred to as legacy carbon, in the atmosphere. Even if we were to stop all CO2 emissions tonight, that trillion tons of excess CO2 would still linger in the atmosphere, causing climate chaos. So our goal is to set the stage for a number of carbon dioxide removal solutions to scale up and together begin operating at restoration scale, which is about 50 billion tons a year by 2030. That's a huge number. We're in the, I think, thousands of tons right now, officially. So it's a long way to go, but we believe we can do it. So 50 billion tons a year for 20 years. At that rate, by 2050, 1 trillion tons of CO2 will have been removed from the atmosphere. We are not in the business of picking particular winners or losers among the carbon dioxide removal solutions, but we do focus on solutions that are scalable, financeable, and permanent. We see a number of promising solutions, both technological and natural. Next slide, Gary. So the Paris Agreement in 2015 famously calls for net zero emissions by 2050, with a hope that the world would then be limited to a 1.5 degree rise in temperature. All pathways for arriving at that endpoint require large-scale carbon dioxide removal. We believe that we can and must do better than that to ensure a world in which humans and other living things can thrive. The IPCC on carbon dioxide removal says, quote, unless affordable and environmentally and socially acceptable CDR, carbon dioxide removal, becomes feasible and available at scale well before 2050, 1.5 degree consistent pathways will be difficult to realize. So the IPCC is saying a similar thing to what we're saying, but F4CR is pushing for more, faster. That's really the big difference there. Next slide, please. Before I talk more about carbon dioxide removal in the context of COP26, I wanted to talk a little bit about the impressive youth presence that I witnessed in Glasgow. I was an outsider. This was my first COP. And when I was there, I saw 4 distinct, but sometimes overlapping COPs taking place. Number one, the one that everyone thinks of, inside the official blue zone, where the negotiators and observers were. Number 2, in the green zone, where it was mostly companies had their climate-related activities on display. 3, at fringe events around Glasgow that were not directly sanctioned by the UN. And 4, protest actions on the streets. So for the sake of brevity, I'll touch first on what I saw from youth inside the blue zone and then outside. So the photo on the left on this slide shows 3 young people from vulnerable island states, Fiji, Papua New Guinea, and Montserrat in this case. And they spoke at a side event in the blue zone. They brought powerful perspectives about current climate impacts on their communities. They also talked a lot about what their elders and their cultures have taught them about respect for nature. And they also talked a lot about current failures of leadership by politicians and others in power. I wanted to share a quick story that was told by Epeli, who's the young man on the left in that left-hand photo. He's from Fiji. And he talked about a traditional type of canoe in Fiji called the vaka, in which the older community members sit in the back of the canoe and row, propelling the boat forward. The younger people sit in the front, navigating and guiding the boat in the right direction. So what he told me and what he told the group is that is the way forward. That's the way forward for climate action. Youth in the front, navigating us forward. So I saw more than I expected of this kind of youth leadership, of this explicit calling out for youth leadership at events inside the Blue Zone. What I expected more of is represented by that photo on the right on this slide, which is an event that was hosted by 4 university students who were part of a network called the Youth Environmental Alliance in Higher Education. So these students and dozens of their young colleagues are students of climate policy and climate finance, and they were at COP26 to follow the official negotiations and learn the ropes, as it were. Next slide. Outside the Blue Zone, there was tons of youth energy everywhere that you looked. A couple specific things I wanted to mention here. First, there were a couple spaces in Glasgow that were open to the public and structured as places for young people to come together and strategize, talk about climate action, build camaraderie, and plan for collaboration. In the photo on the left, this is from an event at a converted barge on the River Clyde in Glasgow, which was called the Extreme Hangout. The event I went to was not extreme, but it featured young people from around the world doing amazing climate-related projects in their home countries. These projects are all funded by the YMCA, and the name of the session was The Power of Investing in Youth. All these presenters were quick to point out that the YMCA was not just throwing some money at them to do a cool project. They also provide mentorship, help bring people to the table, and present opportunities for them to elevate their projects. So access, mentorship, these are non-monetary ways that a group was able to really assist communities around the world in climate adaptation projects. So the second thing, I'm sure you saw reports about this on the news, was the youth-led protests in Glasgow. There was an incredible amount of energy and passion here. There were well-known youth activists like Greta who were at the forefront, at least as far as the media was concerned, but the passion, hope, and anxiety all ran deep. I'm not sure if you can see what it says on that sign, that blue sign on the right there. It says, "Our parents will die of old age. Our children will die of climate change." So in all the conversations I had with young people outside of the Blue Zone, it was clear that that's not just an eye-catching slogan to them. There's real deep anxiety that this is the inevitable trajectory of the climate crisis. And so just a quick story back to my youth, real quick. In 2002, 2003, as a 23-year-old, I lived in Scotland and was involved in the nationwide protests against the impending US-UK invasion of Iraq. A big part of my role then was going to high schools around Scotland to do nonviolence trainings for students who were opposed to their country's position and were gearing up for one of the biggest national mobilizations the UK's ever seen. That anti-war protest was incredible, it was passionate, but when the US and UK invaded Iraq anyway, a few weeks later, the air essentially went out of the balloon, and the youth portion of the anti-war movement largely withered. I don't get the same impression at all here with the young people who are speaking out for climate action. I see deep, deep concern, but also absolute determination to see this thing through. One final thing to note here on youth, while the political outcomes of COP26 were clearly insufficient for what the youth voice was demanding, I did notice that on the inside, it was impossible to ignore their voice. I feel like they're making progress. The question I have, the question I know they have, is whether that's going to be enough progress in a quick enough time. Next slide, please. So last thing is I want to say a few things about carbon dioxide removal in connection to COP26. So CDR was not a meaningful part of the official agenda of COP, but there were a good number of side events in the blue zone that dealt with it. One particular CDR event of note at COP26 was the launch of the Global Carbon Removal Partnership. The Foundation for Climate Restoration co-founded this task force a couple years ago, and it's now matured into a standalone partnership that includes the national governments of Kenya and Colombia, municipalities like LA and Phoenix, educational institutions like Arizona State, innovative carbon dioxide removal companies, and NGOs like ours. Most CDR spins are in the early pilot stages, and the goal of my organization and emerging partnerships like the one that launched at COP is to create the enabling environment for these solutions to scale up and become viable on a huge scale. So I'll leave it there for now, and looking forward to the Q&A, and maybe we can dive into some of this a little further.
Great, Rick. Thank you so much. Very interesting. Okay, let's get into our brief Q&A period. We don't have that much time, but I've got a few questions that I'd like to pose. Let me start with Karen, and I'd like to personalize this. And first ask, Karen, how did you originally become interested in climate issues?
At my beautiful rural cabin in Michigan, I thought of my 6-month-old granddaughter and wondered what her world would look like when she was my age, 60 years in the future. I didn't like the answer. I was inspired by a great episode of This American Life, Hot in My Backyard. I'll put the title in the chat. And said, can't get the right people in the room, huh? Well, Rotary is the right room. I was a new Rotarian. And what's Rotary doing? And I went looking and found not much at all. So I decided to make a space for it. I thought the people of goodwill had this climate thing in hand after I spent a long time working on transit and air quality. And it was really appalling to learn that they didn't the weekend the world passed 400 parts per million.
Wow, wow. Okay, Rick, how about your origination of climate issues?
Sure. So I got two things to say on that. Number one, my real initial interest came through my work with the people in the government of the Marshall Islands. Gary, as you mentioned in my introduction, I had the privilege of working very closely with the Marshall Islands in their lawsuits against the 9 nuclear armed nations at the International Court of Justice a few years ago. And the lead government official on those cases was Tony DeBroom, who was the foreign minister. He was also a leading figure in the Paris climate negotiations in 2015. And so I learned a lot from him directly on what climate impacts are really on the ground, what it means to people who are deeply affected by it on the island. So that was kind of my first introduction to it. And then with the Foundation for Climate Restoration, I've been a part of the organization for 3 months. But what really inspired me about this organization, what's really special to me, is our goal of restoring the climate by 2050 would mean that by the time my daughter is my age, she's 12 right now, by the time she's my age, the climate will have been restored if we're successful in our mission. So that gets me out of bed every day early to work hard on this.
I bet it does. Rick, let's stay with you. And, you know, most of us on this line haven't been to a COP. Many of us would like to. But tell us about what was it like? What was your personal experience like being there amongst, what, 30,000 people, I think I heard, had attended this particular COP?
Yeah, it felt like there were 30,000 people there. I don't know. And I went in having been to a number of big UN events, just not a COP. This was on a scale that I had never experienced. It was really impressive. It was impossible to do everything. So you had to be organized and really focus in on what it was that you wanted to accomplish that day. It felt, it was overwhelming. It's an interesting conundrum. Just in the blue zone, many countries and some of the larger NGOs have these very fancy displays, and you wonder what's behind that, right? Are they trying to look good on the international stage, or are they really doing this work and trying to bring it further? So I always tried to temper my cynicism, give people the benefit of the doubt, and really believe that everyone was there for the right reasons.
And Rick, did you have an official role or a particular idea of what you wanted to do when you were there?
Well, it was very difficult to get a pass into the blue zone. And so I actually was accredited as a member of the press. So I was writing stories for a small international news outlet called Crescenza. So part of what I needed to do was fulfill my obligations to them as a journalist. But I was also, of course, there with my F4CR hat on. And my primary goal, I had two primary goals, I suppose. One was just meeting people. I was like 6 weeks into the job at that point. So I needed to meet people quickly, just get my face out there, get to know who's who. But also on top of that, just talking with people about our mission, our strategy, and particularly in the context of this big international conference on climate change, to get people's feedback on one of our main strategies, which is to promote carbon dioxide removal and climate restoration solutions at the subnational level. So like on the state, provincial, city level. And so, yeah, those were the two main things that I was trying to accomplish.
Great. Karen, back to you. What was it like for you to be there? And what official role and duty, you talked about a little of that during your time, but what was it like for you to be there?
Well, I have two COPs to reflect on. The 2018 COP in Katowice was smaller. It wasn't, and in part the expectations were lower because it wasn't time for the 5-year look back called the global stocktake. That's what was happening at Glasgow. So we were coasting at midterms. We weren't going to the final exam. And I experienced the first COP as someone who had last thought about a subject in first grade, had kind of slept through it in high school, and was all of a sudden thrown into postdoctoral research. Absolutely mind-bogglingly overwhelming. This time, rather than being a lone advanced scout, I went to persuaded then Dean of Rotary Representative Network for Rotary to let me go before Rotary had an area of focus for the environment. And some of my takeaways from that helped set ESRAG up to advocate for that. This COP, I was part of a 5-person delegation. I was not the lead. And the person who, the Dean of the Rotary Representative Network, correctly saw her mission as creating a great event for Rotary International President Shekhar Mehta. As a newcomer on the climate stage, Rotary wanted to look good in an appropriate sized event. We teamed up with the Commonwealth, talked about mangroves. It was a sweet spot for everyone, and we could check the box that Rotary had had a positive debut. Other team members worked on the poster competition, did a great job getting the Rotary seal out with a lot of compelling student artwork. But the technical business that I cared about wasn't on the main Rotary task agenda. So that was kind of frustrating for me. That's why I'm having such a great time talking to this wonderful group of people about what I think was the important stuff of the COP.
Great. Let me stick with,
outcome.
yeah, and Karen, let me stick with you. You spoke briefly in your talk about finance. What more did you learn about the financial challenge challenges of the climate crisis, having attended the financial sessions?
That we're not doing a good job managing the money that controls whether we decarbonize or not.
Hmm. Mhm.
I talked a fair bit around that slide. I think the notion of fossil fuel subsidies is just absolutely insane. If it only takes $8.5 billion to decarbonize South Africa, how much more will it cost to help India, a much more populous country, decarbonize?
Mhm.
And why are we, it's like bailing the bathtub with a teaspoon while we're paying a fire department to come in with big hoses and fill up the bathtub at the other end.
Very good vision.
And we're paying for both processes. It's
Yep.
insane. And I think each of us that has any money invested anywhere has to be asking, how are you managing my money?
Yep.
You can go on the GFANS website and find a list of the financial institutions and funds that are signatories. And if your bank and your broker aren't one of them, maybe you don't want them to be your bank and your broker anymore.
Mhm.
And if they aren't, and you've got a little money there and a little leverage, tell them, how's come you're not with the program? Don't you have grandkids on this planet?
Well, it sounds like we have sort of mixed wins and losses from the conference. And Karen, sticking with you, I'm just wondering, having returned from Glasgow, are you more optimistic or more pessimistic about humanity being able to successfully tackle the crisis and staying, let's say, to no more than plus 1.5 degrees centigrade?
I'm pretty pessimistic.
What's the primary reason?
Because we know what we've had to do for a long time. And there's no political will from our leaders to do it. And we as individuals, I think, have been too slow to find the leverage to push up from the bottom. And in a moment of giddy optimism,
Mhm.
when I look at what Rotary has accomplished with polio, and the fact that we are precisely what some of the negotiators have said we need, a distributed network of local community leaders to get the job done. There's no better description of Rotary than that.
Yep.
If every Rotarian were to put their backs into it with the same effort that we've put into eradicating polio, because of how networked we are, we might be able to get the attention of the world leaders. But nobody gives up power readily, and money is power. And getting that wealth transfer to happen, even if it's in our long-term best interests, at the moment I'm fine, why should I bother?
Yep. Yep. Okay. Very honest response. Rick, same question to you. More optimistic or more pessimistic?
Well, I oscillate a bit, but I've got to say I lean most minutes of most days toward optimism.
Yep.
And part of it is the energy that I saw from youth. I mean, that's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about that in my presentation today. The energy that's there, the deep thought, the poise of young people who I met in Glasgow, who are on the international stage, who are elbowing their way onto the international stage, like it or not. That gives me optimism. That gives me hope. And these are not, we're talking about people in their teens, in their 20s. These are not future leaders. These are, they are leading right now. So that gives me a lot of hope. And also just to say that there are a number of countries that are seeking to do the right thing. A number of cities, we're trying to get some state level action here in the US to really build this up and show that saving our environment does not have to be just a charitable thing that costs a bunch of money. We can integrate this into the economic system and you know, continue to companies can continue to make money, but they need to start doing the right thing. They need to shift their practices and shift direction.
From my perspective, I'm sorry.
No, go ahead. You're good.
From my perspective, I would echo your optimism at this point. I mean, I vacillate like any other climate activist, periods of being down and pessimistic. And certainly I try to be optimistic, but having done this now for between 5 and 10 years in one way or another, I also am seeing the number of people, young and old, but especially college and high school kids, really rallying around, taking action, learning about the issue, and talking about it amongst their peers, and also talking about it with their parents, where oftentimes they will energize their parents, just like Greta did, to take action that can really be beneficial. And I guess the reason for my optimism, a lot of the work that I do with presentations are to college students and high school students, and they are incredibly thirsty for information about this. They realize that their future is basically on the line. They're worried stiff about it. They're trying to make sense about it. And they are getting on board organizations like the Sunrise Movement and many others around that are primarily catering to kids. So yeah, I think both are happening, but for me, it's primarily optimism. And let me just sort of finally, before we go, yeah, Karen?
Well, I was thinking about enlightened self-interest in one of the areas where they did make progress, and I think I forgot to announce it. The big push around methane. We worry first about emissions from burning fossil fuels, and methane or natural gas. It's a fossil fuel when you burn it. The good news is it's cleaner than coal. The bad news is if it leaks and you don't manage it well, it's a lot worse than burning anything else. Yeah. And the new science report from the IPCC said, let's look a little more closely about methane as the next tier of low-hanging fruit. And everyone got together and said they will now look at the 1/3 of methane emissions that come from the gas and oil industry, and the industry will now clean it up. Well, isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
Gee, if you fix your leaks and put in place good housekeeping practices, it means you have more product to sell at the end of your delivery pipeline. Why wouldn't you want to fix the leaks? And I think that notion of enlightened self-interest is one of the cases that we need to be making throughout the world. There's a note in the chat. I switched to climate friendly investments and my portfolio is doing better. My husband and I have had the same experience. But for years, industry has fed us a line. Well, environmental and cost jobs, those bad for the economy. And we have let them back foot us. And we need to take the argument back and make the case that if you decide for the planet, you will prosper and our environment will prosper. Yeah,
yeah. Karen, I'm glad you mentioned methane. You know, it's, as we know, a ticking time bomb. As permafrost in the northern parts of Siberia, Canada, and elsewhere melt, a lot of methane is going to be released also from the ocean. And it just in terms of one approach to manage that, and I think you hit the nail on the head with having to manage leaks. The organization that's been around for about 50 years in the environment, the Environmental Defense Fund, primarily provides legal assistance to climate movements, along with Google and their car initiatives, autonomous and other, have partnered together to be able to determine methane leaks from a meter that's on these cars. And I think that's a very, very important step. The other thing they're about to do, EDF has gotten funding to literally launch a missile into the air that has a satellite that will be able to detect methane emissions in a very, very tiny way and succinct way. So I'm really excited that those kinds of things are happening. Let me ask my final question, then we can open it up. And the question, and Karen, I'll start with you again, is kind of becoming attractions. What do you think will be the key climate challenges for nations next year in Egypt at COP27? Karen, you want to take that one?
People will have promised too little and not even delivered on that. And the big fossil fuel countries and the fossil fuel lobbyists from all around the world will continue to take the stage to disrupt and sabotage. I went to some rule book negotiation sessions, and Saudi Arabia, the worst spoiler there, the climate process, they battled against forming the rule book every step of the way. They didn't want human rights mentioned in any of the paragraphs. It was mentioned in the preamble, and that was more human rights than they wanted anybody to talk about.
Yeah, yeah.
Sorry.
That's all right.
Maybe
That's
it's
the reality.
because I'm older and tired.
Well, you've been there and you can see what's going on. Rick, your perspective on challenges for COP27 next year?
Well, I think the biggest challenge is going to be really quitting the kicking the can down the road. I mean, that
Yep.
is so much of what's happening here. I mean, everywhere you look, every day, it's clearer and clearer. We got no time. We have no more time to waste.
Right.
The action has to start now. And, you know, more and more people are saying that. So the challenge is, are the negotiators, are the nations going to be ready to deal with that at COP27? I hope so.
I think we need the levers of democracy and political empowerment more than ever, as more and more of the world's governments, some drift, some race towards embracing a less democratic government where the governed will have fewer levers of power to make the change that we need.
Well stated. Let me shift to the chat and pick a few out. And John, if you want to take a look at that as well, that would help. Here's one from Philip. And this sounds like it's for Rick. In what ways can Rotary and ESRAG and RCAT partner with the Foundation for Climate Restoration to increase education and outreach? Rick, what do you think?
Well, that's a great question. I spoke with John a few weeks ago, and we started to explore that. Just the first thing that comes to mind is early next year, we'll be launching what we're calling a solution series. I think Erica might have mentioned that in the chat. But we're going to be focusing on one carbon dioxide removal solution every month, pretty much for the whole year. And so getting those educational materials out through your networks to people who are interested and can pass it on further, that's a pretty straightforward way. I would love to talk more about ways that we can become more formally involved, but events like this are really useful, and really happy to have had the opportunity to talk with so many committed people. I saw the introductions in the chat, people all around the US, all around the world. Really impressive. Rotarians really have it dialed in. I'm impressed.
Okay.
Rick,
Go ahead.
one of the, if you don't mind, I would like
Sure.
to emphasize Karen's observation about Rotary as a network. We are incredibly powerful, and we aren't using that power in a productive way in the climate crisis. And anything we can do to find ways to educate our clubs around the world, 35,000 of them in every location, in order to be able to advocate for the environment is really powerful. So I really want to make sure that as we close out on this conversation, that we remind ourselves that we have the power to do something that will really make a difference. So I think terribly important and critical to everything that we do going forward.
And the one other question that I would want to maybe end with builds upon what Karen was talking about in her presentation, which is based on the results, good and bad, from Glasgow, what particular initiatives or actions can groups, chapters within Rotary take on to be able to move this forward? Karen, you want to add anything to that? Or John, if you want to have something?
No,
Can't hear
Karen,
you, Karen. Karen,
you're muted.
Just ask me again. I drifted. I'm so sorry.
No, that's okay. I just wanted to follow up on a point you made in presentation to try to broaden the notion of, based on information and wins and losses that came out of Glasgow, are there additional initiatives that we can point to that various Rotary chapters, clubs around the US and the world can potentially adopt?
Sure. Within ESRAG, we've got a climate action team. We're working with cleaner cook stoves, which has some great implications around avoiding deforestation. We have a group that's working to make every habitat build more hospitable to renewable energy and solar panel installation on the roofs. These are things. One of the challenges is Rotary is policy adverse and prefers to work through projects. Our service projects, people say they want to get their hands dirty. There's only so many light bulbs you can change and trees you can plant without governmental policy backing you up. So you have to put your Rotary badge on your lapel and go sit at the local and regional and state meetings and tell your legislators what they need to do. And you can say I'm a Rotarian. You can't necessarily say I represent the Rotary Club of Hoboken, but I'm a member of the Rotary Club of Hoboken and I care about the environment and this is the right thing to do. And we have your back. And then you can go to the office the next day and make sure that you've got policies in place that support that. And at some point, we will be in a position to say, we're doing the right thing in our private lives. We need our legislators to do the right things in their public lives.
Very practical advice. Rick, anything to add?
Gosh, I know we are we're about, whoops, something just popped up on my screen. I know we're about to run out of time. And I did just want to say to everyone who's interested in making change in their communities, in their state, and in their country as well. We do have some really incredible people who are working to make that happen, and we'd love for you to join them. I put a little info in the chat about that, about who you can contact, but Terry at f4cr.org, TERRI at f4cr.org is our chapter empowerment coordinator. She can get you set up with some people who are near you. We've got some great people like Philip who are on the call, who are already involved, already making waves. So yeah, would love to see a lot more of that. But yeah, we can make this change on the personal level and in our communities to begin with.
That is it from me, John, unless you have anything else you want to add.
No, I
Okay.
really do appreciate. I know this is a huge topic and there's an awful lot to be discussed. And I'm hoping that we're going to have an opportunity to do more of this. Thank you very much,
Good.
Karen. Thank you
Let
very
me,
much, Rick, and thank you, Gary.
Okay, thanks again, Karen and Rick. Appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you.
Thanks
That
for
was
the opportunity, and make sure your SRAG membership's current.